Hey guys, so yesterday I put up a question in the Bricks Builder Facebook community asking whether I should do yet another tutorial on creating cards in Bricks. They're an integral thing you use in every page, every layout. Cards are used in so many different ways. There's a lot of tutorials, there's a lot of ideas. There's lots of libraries out there now that have cards in them. And what I was starting to see is that, in many ways it's coming a little bit like your Element or in your Divi, where quite often the first question is what plugin does that, or where can I find a library that does this? And that's the first question that a lot of people are starting to ask. And to me, it's the wrong question, because most of what you're looking for you can do yourself with a brilliant builder like Bricks and CSS3. It's a matter of just learning more about how CSS works, and you can do whatever you need to do without having to look for third parties. Not always true. There's some fancy stuff that you might need a little bit of help on, but I'd say 90% of what you want to do, you can do by learning a bit more CSS. So what I wanted to do is demonstrate a number of cards. What have we got? 6, 9, I think 10 cards. Yeah, 10 cards here. All different, all using exactly the same base setup and just animating things different or transitioning things differently. So the first one, I've got an image in the header. I've got a heading. I've got some body text. I've got a footer bar, which has got some footer text and a text link. If I roll my mouse over, I get a vignette style gradient overlay, which goes from a darker outside to a lighter inside. The color of my heading and my body text and my footer text change, and my image just scales a little bit, and that's it. That's a very simple card effect, right? We've then got another one which I will not do the way I've done this. I'm actually going to come back to it, and I think there's a better way of doing this. But if I roll my mouse over the second one, I've got a overlay, which is a rounded edge overlay starting from the top left, and that scales and fills the entire space when I roll over. The next one, when I roll over, it's just a standard wipe effect. I'm using inset for this. So it's a standard wipe effect from the left to right and goes back to the left when I take my mouse away. And then on the next row, they're just 3 variations of card 3, where all I'm doing is adding a modifier. So I've got my card 3 plus a modifier, roll my mouse over, instead of going left to right, it goes from right to left. Okay, the next one, I roll my mouse over, it goes from top to bottom with a modifier. Next one goes from bottom to top with a modifier. These 4 cards are exactly the same card, just with a modifier to tell it how to transition the overlay when we hover. We then have these 3 here. Again, they're all the same card. And again, it's just exactly the same code I've got above, but I've just changed some properties on it, where instead of the text sitting underneath the image, it sits on top of it. We've got it transitioning, so we've got it pushed to the bottom, which cuts off all the body text and the footer. Roll my mouse over, and what happens here is the image scales. I think it's scaling differently. Yeah, it's scaling. That one's scaling out, so the image scales in this time. The background rises from the bottom, and the color of the text still change. All of this changing of the text is exactly the same as the cards above it, because this is based on exactly the same code and it's the same principle. Card 4. So if we look at this, the first one here, the card 4 here, we've got spacing, which is fairly consistent. We've got some line height issues here we're going to deal with, but between the top and the bottom and the edges and in between the elements, by adding a space M modifier on the second one, we're just changing the amount of spacing. So the extra spacing from the top, bottom, between our sides and between our elements. And then on the next one along, we can see already down the bottom there's a slight, I'm using my primary color, which is a blue. There's a slight bit of blue there because I've got my primary modifier on there. I roll over, and my background is primary with a little bit of transparency so I can see the image through there. But apart from that, these cards are all identically the same. Okay. Then we've got the last one, when it looks exactly like the other cards up the top here, but when we roll over, our overlay actually transitions from the center out from a rounded borders through to not having random borders all the way out. The color of these transition exactly the same as every other card, but we've got a little bit of transitioning happening on the actual header and the body text as well. I mean, it's not the most beautiful transition there, but it's just showing that you can do it. What's so cool about this is every one of these, it has exactly the same principles behind it. It's just how you animate things that make it work differently. So if we look at the base here, so the editor, I should say, here's our first card. We have, I'm just going to collapse all these. Where's my collapse? Collapse there. It's going to open just the first one. Okay, there's my card V1. If I open that, I have an overlay. And yes, I use an overlay as a div, not as a pseudo. And the reason I do that, you know, I'll work through this and how I'm working with this is to make it more usable for other people. So if I use a before or after pseudo, then you have to go into the CSS to style it. If we use it as an element, we can actually style it through here. So I can change, for example, here, if I change my background color on that to be a maybe a secondary color, change that color there. I've just changed the way that card works, right? So if I change that to be secondary transparent, there we go. So I've just changed the way that card works by using the UI. So that's an easy way of managing this. And that's the way that I've come to build now. Now this card's actually built a little bit differently to what I'd normally do. So I just threw this together for the demo and just replicated it out. I would normally wrap my header, body, and footer into wrappers. I have with the header and the footer, but I didn't with the body there. What was my reason for that? Oh, no, I didn't, because I've only got one element in the body, and the image I need to be able to reorder. So that needs to be in its own element there under the card. All right, so that's the structure. So in here, I've got all I've got in there is a heading. All I've got in there is what have I got there? Not clicking. Okay, footer text, which is basic text, and a text link. That's my entire structure there. Now, CSS wise, if I have a look at the card V1 and have a look at my CSS, and by the way, you probably will see all these shortcuts, all that sort of stuff, and me zapping around in here that you may not have if you don't have advanced Seamer. This is purely productivity and shortcuts, so I can get quicker through this video because I've got to explain a lot of things. You don't need any of this. You can do it all manually. You don't need a framework. You can set up your own framework or just use fixed values. I'm using my own dev framework. I've called it BB framework, and it's basically emulates the variables that you would see in ACSS. And this is just something I use for dev, I should say, not for live. So this is really up to you where you start from, but I'm just showing the concept of how to build it, not what library to use, sorry, not what frameworks to use, not what plugins to use. You can do this without any plugins whatsoever. All right, so we're gonna have a look at the CSS for this. All right, and what we'll do first, we'll look at the naming. Now, there's some of you that argue that, you know, BEM's a waste of time or it's too hard. It's frustrating to me because you need some kind of naming convention to keep everything convenient and keep your productivity. Why not BEM? Whatever it is, whatever naming convention you want to use, stick with it. And I use BEM, B-E-M. If you're not familiar with it, go to getbem.org or getbem.com and have a look at it. And it's just the way you name things, okay? So I've got a card element up here called card space V1, and my block name is card-V1. That's a typical BEM naming. I've got an overlay, which is my card-V1 __ overlay. So each of these elements are named with an underscore, and that's how I name them. Where this becomes also beneficial is when we look at the CSS for these, the way I name these variables, which I'll come back to shortly, is the element name. So that's my overlay opacity. And I do these in pairs. So my overlay opacity is 0. Overlay opacity on hover is 1. Okay, so my overlay here, I'm going to transition the opacity from 0 to 1 when I hover that card. Now, also use focus within, which I'll show you a little bit later, to change that. So my image scale. So my image is the element, my property is the scale. My heading is the element, my property is the color. So that's an easy way for me to name my variables and know that what each of these variables actually is for. Not trying to come up with some name on the fly and working out, does this make sense to me or not? And then coming back in 3 months and go, well, why did I call it that? Or what did I call it? Keep your naming the same. Whatever structure you come up with, use the same one regardless of whether you're doing something small or big. Keep using the same naming and it will make sense to you. All right. So what I have in here, I've got a gap variable, which I'm just setting to my space small. So this is on my card V1. So this is the top one up here. So if I change that space there to space L, okay, see what happens to my card? I've got large spacing everywhere. Okay, so I use the gap for my padding around these elements. Space M, space S. Okay, so that is the spacing that we're going to have around all our elements. I've got two transitions. I always do this. Just keeps the transitioning interesting. I create two transitions. In this case, I've used one of my framework variables so I can keep my timing the same. So I think that's set to 0.4 seconds or something like that, or 0.5 seconds. And I have one for ease in, one for ease out. Okay, and then I can decide which elements do I want to ease in, which ones do I want to ease out, so that they're not all transitioning exactly the same. It just gives it a little bit more effect, and you just decide which ones you're going to apply those transitions to. I think 2's enough. 3's getting too tricky. Right, so that's the transitions. I then have my overlay opacity, in this case, image scale, heading color, body text color, footer text color, and text link color. Again, I've named these exactly the same as what they are on here. Okay. All right, so, whoops, well, I'm on the wrong thing here. Okay, so I'm going to make this a bit bigger so we can see this. It's a bit hard to see in Bricks, right? So I'm going to go full screen here so you can see what this is. And again, that's an AT or an advanced schema feature to be able to do that. So what I typically do is I have variables here. I then set my transitions. And I use a where to weaken our specificity so we can easily override it elsewhere. So I've got a transition for my overlay is using my transition 1. So that's the ease in. Okay. I've got my heading, body text, and footer text using transition 1 as well. I'm not sure why I did it that way. I can't remember. Maybe actually that could probably move into here. And I can get rid of that one rule there. Our text link, it's the only one in this one I'm using transition 2 on for whatever reason. And then what we have to do here is with the image, when you, I'm using a figure for my image. And when you use a figure, what happens is that you get a figure element and then inside that you get a image. And this is one of the only elements in Bricks where, there's a couple actually, but there's only very few where it has the an inner element that you don't have access to in the UI. Everything else, you access the element that you put on the structure panel. Okay, with a figure, you add it as an image, you tell it it's a figure, and your classes get applied to that figure, but then there's an image element inside that figure that you can't see in the builder. So here, what we have to do is set our image to, which is the figure in this case. We're going to set that overflow to heading and then set our transition on the image inside of it to transition to, and our scale is our scale variable up here. So it's this image scale there, right? So by default, this is image scale of 1. Okay, and that's the scale there. So if I change my first, this has gone a bit weird here. If I change my image scale to be 0.3, see it's scaled in there. And then if I change the image scale on hover to be 1, I'm going to go from large to small. So I've just changed the way that image is working just by changing two variables. What's the normal state? What's the hover state? Okay, that's the beauty of doing it this way. So just pairs of what's the normal state, what's the hover state, normal state, hover state. Same with all these colors here. So if I changed my hover on my heading. Let's change that. And this autocomplete here is advanced theme, so I'm going to use my primary. Primary light. Where's my primary light? There we go. I'm going to change that to primary light on hover. Okay, now that didn't work. There we go. I need to press space. So now I've changed on hover, my card heading is going from neutral to primary light. All right, so it's as simple as just changing variables once you've got it set up. How does this work? Okay, down the bottom here, all I'm doing is doing on my cards on the root of card V1. If I'm hovered or focused within, overlay opacity is now my overlay opacity hover. Image scale is now my image scale hover. So it's just mapping that variable to be its hover version when we hover or focus within. That's all we're doing in the CSS here. We're not actually setting the values on the elements. So once we've got those, let's have a look at the overlay opacity. If we go to the overlay and we have a look at our opacity for our overlay, I'm using the variable of overlay opacity. Okay. If I go to, let's pick another one, CSS jumps all over the place. So image we do here because we can't access the image element under the figure, so we do have to do that in the CSS here. There's a couple like that, like box shadows we can't do because of the individual inputs in bricks. There's a couple there where we can't do because we don't have a single input for the CSS rule. So let's have a look at our heading color here. So heading color, look at our heading, not the header, the heading, and look at our font, typography, and our color is our raw value of var heading color. So once I've defined all those variables, I go into my elements and I set the variables on the actual elements. Why do I do that? Because then you can easily override it using the UI. So once this is set up, this is a set and forget, basically. Once you set that up, you just go to the elements and you can change things and override what's happening here if you want to. Okay, so that's the principle of it. Okay, let's have a look at the second. Actually, we won't look at the second card because I'm actually going to do this differently. Let's look at the card 3. So we go to card 3. And let's have a look at our CSS for card 3. And you see here, it's exactly the same as card 1. Okay, what's different? We've now on our overlay, because we want to animate our overlay, we want a overlay opacity on hover is 0.9. So we want to see a little bit of the background through there, right? If I make that say 0.7 on overlay, okay, I can see more of the background, right? Because it's got more transparency. So I'll make that back to, I'll make it 0.8. I think that was a little bit too little. There we go. So we've got a overlay going from left to right of a transparency of 0.8, opacity of 0.8, I should say, because we just changed that one variable. So we've got, this is what I've added here for my transitioning of the overlay. We're using inset. Again, we're targeting our overlay, and the CSS property is inset block start. So get used to inset. It's an interesting way of doing things, and it's quite difficult to get your head around at first, which I'll show you why. And what happens on hover. So what we're saying is that for our overlay on this one, our block start and end is 0 either way. So block start means go to the top, block end means go to the bottom. So that there stays the same regardless, right? So you think, what's the point of having that? Why don't we just make it 0? I'll show you shortly. So then we've got our inline start. We want to start from 0, and on hover, 0. So basically we're saying we want the left edge to start at 0 and stay at 0 when we hover. So the left edge isn't changing, right? On the right edge, which is the end, we want to start that at 100%. This is where inset gets confusing. When you say it's 100%, we're saying we want it to be 100% from the end. So if we're talking about the end, which is the right, we want that to be 100% from the end, which actually pushes it to the left. And then we want it to go back to 0 from the end when we're hovering. Okay, so that's how inset works, which gets confusing because it's kind of the opposite. You got to think of the opposite logic to where that is. So at the end, we want to push that to the other side. We've got to set it to 100%. Okay. The rest of this is exactly the same. All right. So that's what makes this card work differently to that one. All right. And on the overlay, actually should say on the overlay here, if we go to the overlay and set our color, where's our background? There's our color there. So if we want that to be a different color, let's say we want that to be our secondary. We get our secondary, maybe with a little bit of transparency. Actually, we don't need transparency because we've got that on the okay, there we go. So we've just changed that by changing the card color. Everything else stays the same, right? Actually, we've changed it on the class, so it's changing everywhere, right? Because we changed it on the class. So that's an interesting point. Let's say get rid of that. So they're all back to, whoops, not get rid of it on the class. Put it back on our primary dark. Now they're all primary dark. Okay, now let's say on this particular one here, we didn't want it to affect all of them. We just want a different one on that particular card. We can create a modifier or get rid of that class off there. And at the ID level, we're going to change the background here to be our secondary dark. Okay, now that one now, oops, that's the wrong one. What are we on? Overlay 3. Here we go. So on the secondary, so on the card V3, we've got the secondary dark overlay. On the other ones, we've got the primary because we only changed that at the ID level for that particular card. All right, now, so the left to right makes sense, top to bottom. Let's have a look at the top to bottom. So card top to bottom, what we're doing is we're adding a modifier. Okay, let's have a look at the modifier. All we're doing on the modifier is changing those variables. All right, so on the modifier from top to bottom, we want our inline, inset inline to be 0. So we don't want the to change from left to right. We just want that to be 0 on both normal and hover. Our start, we want to be 0, 0. So start from the top and stay at the top. And on the hover, on the end, we want it to be 100% from the bottom, going back to a 0%, 0 from the bottom on hover. And then we just do the opposite for the bottom. Our modifier on the bottom is the opposite. So we start from the block end, we want it to stay at the bottom, whether it's on normal or hover. And on the top, we want to start from 100% from the top and go back to 0 from the top on hover. All right, so that's as simple as that. So this is the beauty of setting up your class, your CSS using these variable pairs. So it's very simple for you to override these with modifiers. And then down here, when you add them, you just need to make sure that you add them to here so that you make sure your normal state here maps to your hover state when you're hovering or focusing. All right, let's look at the last card here, this heading 5. And it looks more complicated, right? Because of the way that's hovering. Let's have a look at the CSS on that. All right, so it's exactly the same as the top to bottom, bottom to top, except for we've told it the block start, end, inline start and end are all at 50%, which means that it's in the center. It's in the center of the space, that's the relative space above it. It's in the center of that. And then when we hover, all of them go to 0, which means they all go top, right, bottom, left, all go back to 0. So the element grows. And then we have a border radius when we're normal state and a border radius when we're hovered. So 200 pixels, so it's rounded. And then when we hovering, it goes back to 0. And that's it. So that card there, even though it looks flasher, is exactly the same as these cards here, with just the inset values changed on these variables. Okay, we then have added a couple other things here. So on this card heading here, basically, where am I up here? Going back to my card V5. Okay, this is my card V5 heading. Now, what have we added here? We've added a, oh, here we go, heading transform. So again, transform is the property, right? So we get heading transform of none. When we hover, we want to translate the y of -1m, translate the x of 1m, and scale it by 0.1, right? And that's what's moving it. The footer text transform, body text transform is none. So when we're not hovered, there's no transform. And when we are hovered, we want to translate the y. Now, I think with this, let me have a look here. Where's my transform? I've got to look at this, sorry. So my footer. There we go. Because the Bricks UI has multiple inputs for your transform, so there's the translate X, translate Y, translate Z, rotate, scale, all that sort of stuff. I've had to do that in the CSS here, or we'd have to create separate variables for every input that we have in the Bricks UI, which we can do. But I thought it's easier just to put it all on a single shorthand line here and just do that in the CSS because we don't have a single input in Bricks. So transform, box shadow, things like that where there's only where there's multiple inputs for the values, it's easier to just do it in the CSS here. So that's it. And the body text, again, we transform here, transform by the body text. So our variables up here is transform. Where are we? Body text transform, none. Body text transform hover is translate Y. Down here, we're telling it to transform the body text. We also added a body text here to the transition to transition 1. So it just keeps all, these are all the elements we want to use. The ease, where are we? Transform, transition 1 is the ease in. Okay, and that's it. That's how we animate the card here. So that is an awful lot to go through. I think it's a really cool way of doing it because it keeps things really, really simple. In a nutshell, what we do is we create pairs of our non-hovered state and our hovered state. Wherever that property exists in the Bricks UI, we just use it on that element in the UI, or that property, I should say, the opacity, inset block, etc. We just use that on the actual element. Actually, here's a good example here. So the inset block start, if we go to the overlay and have a look here and have a look at our insets. Where is that inset? That's what we don't have. That's right. They don't have inset here, so we have to do that manually. So it's another one that's hasn't got an inset. Yes, it does. It does have inset. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Sorry, just thinking. No, we haven't because we haven't got the inset property in the Bricks UI. We're doing it in the CSS here. So we've got inset using our variables just here. Okay. Oh, by the way, for the overlay, we're just unsetting the min width and min height because in the builder, an empty div goes to a minimum of 90 by 90. And that's just for the builder. All right, so that is the concept. I think this has been a fairly long video. I think what we'll do is we'll leave it at that and we'll do a follow-up supplementary video where we use this principle to create our own cards from base. So we start from fresh and we'll create our own cards from fresh. So I'm going to leave this video here. That is the concept of it. If you want the additional video, let me know. Otherwise, I won't bother. But if you guys want a video where we actually work through creating a couple of cards, then I'm happy to do that. Let me know because I think we might get a little bit of tutorial fatigue on this sort of stuff. So, all right. I hope you like this sort of thing. If you do, hit the subscribe, hit the like. Thanks, guys.